Welcome to the history of football as we explore its evolution and the triple schism that led to our four distinct games of football that are played around the world. There is evidence of foot games going back to early man and ancient civilizations of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, as well as other cultures around the world, including Mesoamerica, Asia, and southern Africa. During medieval times, European towns and villages each had their own version of kicking games, often covering vast distances and having even hundreds of players on a side. Mob football, comprising villagers battling each other over a ball, slowly evolved toward more organized leisure games, and in the 1700s, schools and universities started using football as a way to provide discipline, shape gentlemen, and instill social values for their students. Each school had their own set of rules, quite often non-written. As legend goes, in 1823, rugby school student William Webb Ellis picked up the ball and ran with it, introducing a new element to the game of football that several schools adapted in some form. Through the 1820s, there was very little interplay between schools, so nobody cared that each group had different rules, and folk football was a very decentralized game with no governing body. Then something changed that would force football to become more regulated and would put one country in the forefront of its governance: the development of passenger railways in England. Prior to railways, football at one school could vary greatly from another in both rules and culture. Rugby, Marlborough, and Cheltenham played what is known as a passing game, where the ball was exchanged between players. Eton, Westminster, Charterhouse, and Shrewsbury played more of a dribbling game, where players acted more like blockers for their teammates with the ball. Depending on the rain and surface conditions, handling the ball was usually allowed in some form. Some fields were small, some were quite large, and quite often there were up to 30 players on a side. As teams started traveling to play, often against people that were not necessarily friends, rivalries developed and the games became more violent, sometimes resulting in death. There were calls to ban football, so in order to make the game safer for schoolboys, around 1840, there was a movement to codify the rules of football, but every school had their own version. At Rugby, the terrain was soft, so they wanted to continue to allow players to handle and run with the ball. The hard ground at Eton and Cambridge was much more suitable for the dribbling game, and Eton was one of the first schools to push for disallowing players using their hands. As alumni from various schools would attempt to play games at Cambridge, the differences in the rules became apparent. The Shrewsbury folks first attempted to set rules that all could agree upon in 1842, but that failed. They attempted once again in 1846, this time including other schools' alumni to achieve consensus, but they could not overcome the differences with the Rugby alumni, so the effort did not prevail. In an effort to finally standardize the rules in 1848, Cambridge student Henry Charles Malden gathered alumni of 5 English schools to hammer out what is considered the first set of agreed-upon rules, which became known as the Cambridge Rules. While no known copies of the first rules are in existence, they were somewhat accepted, but were not entirely successful. The Rugby and Harrow schools especially continued to insist on the necessity for using hands and to be allowed to hack, meaning to kick in the shins. And at about this same time, Eton documented their field game, which had some distinct differences that players were not eager to give up. So this unity was pervasive between the various groups. As a side note, the Eton field game, which is still played separately from football at Eton, has some elements that came across the ocean to evolve into American football. In the field game, players can score 3 points for kicking a goal, or pass to a teammate behind the goal for 5 points, known as a rouge, which is why the end zone in American football is referred to as the red zone. The field game also introduced the concept of one team having to consistently move the ball by converting down toward the opponent's goal. As converting can sometimes be a judgment call, the field game was one of the first to advocate for the need of referees. Back at Cambridge, in an effort to revitalize their initial effort to unify football rules, in 1856, Frederick G. Sykes and G. Perry gathered former students from 4 schools to update the Cambridge rules. The results are considered the first unified rules of football that were successful and are the basis for modern football rules. There are still a few original copies of these signed rules in existence, and even some photos of the original signers. The rules define the goal as having flag posts with a string and stated that teams would switch ends after each goal, with the losing team taking the kickoff, but would allow for local rules to the contrary. They favored the dribbling game and disallowed running with the ball, but still allowed players to use their hands to stop the ball or to perform a fair catch, which would result in a free kick. The Cambridge rules tried to address the brutality by introducing the concept of a foul and disallowing holding, tripping, and pushing with the hands. Everything else was still fair game though, and they did not find any recourse for such a foul. They introduced the concept of a pitch, which would be defined by flags and the ball being out of play or behind the goal. And they introduced the idea of a goal kick when the ball is behind, to be taken at 10 paces by the defenders regardless of which team kicked it. And the throw-in when out, which had to be performed at right angles to the flag line. Each school still relied on local customs and resources to determine the number of players per side and the size of field, yet still no referees. The Cambridge rules also codified the concept of requiring at least 4 defenders in front of a player and barring players from loitering in front of the ball, which is now known as being offside. Drawings from that time indicate that the game was still very much scrum oriented. Fun fact, the fair catch free kick in American football, which is a seldom used legacy rule, originated from the Cambridge rules. As the students who created and played under the Cambridge rules graduated and migrated back to their hometowns, they took with them the idea that football could be more than just a game for schoolboys and started forming independent teams. One of the very first was the Sheffield Football Club in 1857, and of course, they came up with their own set of rules, called the Sheffield Rules. The Sheffield Rules were similar to those of Cambridge, and became dominant in the North and Midlands of England. Some of the elements were counter to the Cambridge rules, yet some served to clarify and support them. The rules defined the area off the pitch as the touch area, and whichever team got to the ball first was awarded possession. They also used throw-ins when the ball was out, but when the ball went behind, rather than a goal kick, a free kick at the 25-yard flag was awarded to the team who gained possession. There was no offside rule. They barred hacking, but went back to allowing pushing with the hands. They clarified that a goal could not be scored from a fair catch kick, nor a push from the hand. They also declared that there was no limit to the number of players on a side, and in deference to the schools that favored handling the ball could be any size or shape, namely oval. Still no referees, but they codified the idea that there would be captains whose duty it was to settle any disputes, and that for games of significance, there would be a committee in attendance to settle any lingering disputes. Fun facts: one team was to wear red hats while the other was to wear blue. We still use red versus blue in football formation diagrams to this day to illustrate attackers versus defenders. Also, when the ball is behind and a player touches it to establish possession, that is known as a touchdown. And the rules documented that for a kickoff, the ball must be stationary and on the ground, which is referred to as a place kick. So 2 relic terms that made their way into American and Canadian football. In 1859, the Melbourne Football Club created their own rules for the game, which were fairly indistinguishable from those in England. However, with the great distance, they did not have the cultural pressure to work out their differences with nearby clubs, and with all the influx of immigrants bringing their own elements of the game, especially from Ireland, the Melbourne rules took an evolutionary path that would slowly diverge itself from English football. Eventually, this path would be seen as the first schism of football, leading to what we now know as footy, or Australian rules football. Back in Cambridge, in November 1862, a game was scheduled between the Old Etonians and the Old Harrovians. and in deference to a lingering desire to honor their own school's traditions, they drafted a set of compromise rules just for this game. In response to this, the folks at Cambridge decided they needed to once again gather the various alumni groups to achieve complete consensus on an updated set of rules. To illustrate the success and effectiveness of their conclave, they published their updated rules in several British newspapers in 1863. Here are some of the rule changes. They defined the size of the pitch to be 100 yards wide by 150 yards long. The string was removed and the goal could be scored at any height, and the goals were defined as 15 feet wide. The fair catch was eliminated, but a player could still use his hand to stop the ball. The offside rule was made stricter in that all players must be behind the ball at the moment of a kick, regardless of where the opponents were. While they did not define consequences for fouls, they did introduce the idea that opponents have to give a player performing a free kick 10 yards of distance. The throw-in was replaced with the kick-in. Replacing the goal kick, they adapted the Sheffield touchdown free kick rule for when the ball went behind. While there was no actual halftime, the teams would change goals roughly halfway through the game. Still, no referees, and total match time and number of players was left up to teams to decide. But the kickoff and the direction would be decided by a coin toss. Of the changes, it was the offside rule that had the biggest and most lasting influence on the game. Since no player could set up in front of the ball, there was no reason to have deep defenders. A very typical formation in the 1860s was the 1-1-9 or the 1-2-8, but this could still vary since the total number of players on the field were still left to local customs. The players off the line during this time were referred to as halfbacks and fullbacks. As a result, most players on the field would line up near the ball, and the scrum dominated this period. One of the reasons the fair catch was eliminated was to increase the fluidity of the game. But for leagues that continued to allow the fair catch, the game turned into a series of plays that were initiated at every fair catch stoppage, which gave rise to the formats we still see in rugby and American football. About this same time, 11 clubs in the London area decided to unite as a league in October 1863. This football association, or FA, is the oldest surviving football association in the world, but it almost did not happen because they could not decide on the rules. Fortunately, their secretary, Ebenezer Mosley, recognized the unity that the new Cambridge rules represented and suggested the FA should adapt them as their own. FA president Arthur Pember was open to the Cambridge rules, but insisted on a few differences. The field was to be 200 yards long. The goal was to be 8 yards wide. The fair catch was reinstated. The FA rules reverted to the throw-in. Teams switched side after every goal. The touchdown free kick was moved to 15 yards from the goal line. And for the first time, the rules addressed some safety issues, barring cleats from having any dangerous projections. Also for the first time, the rules contain a section for definitions, which is evidence they were attempting to appeal to fellow clubs by making their rules easier to understand and less susceptible to local interpretation. These became known as the London Rules. Fun fact, the FA was often referred to as the Association, or ASOC for short. This is how the term soccer came to be used. So yes, soccer is an English term. Thanks for watching. Please look for our next video where we pick up with the history of football in the mid-1860s.